Good evening. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU, and it is my great, great pleasure to welcome you to a very, very special evening tonight at Deutsches Haus. We'll have Daniel Kehlmann in conversation with Mark Mitten talking about consciousness and the art of illusion. And to my knowledge, this is the first time ever in the history, in the long, long history of Deutsches Haus, where we'll have an author and a magician in conversation. And I think the very first time also that we have a practicing magician in a presentation at Deutsches Haus. So very, very special, very extraordinary, and I don't know what will happen, so prepare yourself. I've always liked magic and magicians and literature and authors, and as I was thinking about this event and about myself, I love to do that. No, it's not true. But I was thinking, why does it appeal to me so much? And I realized it's about the truth of deception. And I think that has always strangely appealed to me. And I think many here in this audience share that taste. That would be my guess. But before I delve any further in the psychoanalysis of the appeal of magic and literature, I would like to be more pragmatic and thank a whole bunch of individuals and entities. First of all, of course, Daniel and Mark for being here tonight, and Daniel for the tremendously original and wonderful idea of bringing this event here. I'm really very, very grateful. I would like to thank our good friends at the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU and, of course, at the German department. Many of you are here tonight. I'm so grateful for the terrific collaboration and the crucial support of Deutsches Haus. It is always a pleasure to collaborate with all of you. Thank you. Thanks to Greenlight Bookstore. They have some of Daniel's books on sale here, and he's graciously agreed to sign some of them afterwards. So please buy some books and get them signed by the author himself, and maybe even Mark can add some special touch or conjure them away to somebody in need of a good Daniel Kehlmann novel. I'd also like to thank the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, for their continued support of our programs. We are very grateful to them. I'd like to thank my wonderful colleagues, my staff, our interns, student workers, our videographers, our photographer, for all making this happen. We couldn't do it without them. And now let me see what I have on the second page. I forgot. I would like to thank you for coming to Deutsches Haus, for being such good, loyal customers. And I would like to remind those of you who don't speak German yet, you can also learn German at Deutsches Haus. Our slogan, as you all now know by heart, is Learn German If You Dare, D-E-R, conjured up by Eric Jarosinski, and we are so thrilled about this slogan. Remember, the holidays are coming always suddenly and unexpectedly, so you might want to get a German class for one of your loved ones. That took you a while to process, but I'm glad it finally sank in. And I'm almost done. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Eric Banks, the director of the New York Institute of the Humanities at NYU. And I would like to thank him for the continued wonderful collaboration, great conversations we have all the time. It is a pleasure to work with you, to work and to walk with you, and I really appreciate it. And before he then introduces Daniel and Mark, please switch off, silence your cell phones, because otherwise Mark will turn you into pink rabbits. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Eric.
I will walk with you and talk with you, Juliana, anytime. It is always a pleasure for the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU to collaborate with Deutsches Haus. It's always a very pleasurable and very interesting set of events that we're able to work on together. And we couldn't have chosen better partners. It's just such a pleasure. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to introduce our speakers this evening. I want to start off by just pointing out that they've decided to take on some small topics as their point of departure. What is illusion? It might be just as simple to ask, what is consciousness? The question that has entertained the philosophical mind since Plato, but picked up considerable gusto since the foundational writings of Descartes. It is today at once the most picked over and promising subjects for philosophers of mind, a perplexing yet elusive topic, particularly among those who work in proximity with their expansive colleagues in neuroscience. We might add to them the Guild of Magicians. Consciousness, as we will hear tonight, is intrinsically linked to the craft of illusion, and it is no surprise to realize that some of the most paradigmatic thought experiments in experimental psychology today turn to the very fodder of the prestidigitator's trade. Misdirection and the gap between what our conscious self tells us is taking place and what we later find out to be the case. In tonight's program, we are pleased to welcome two authorities on illusion to share the same stage and to discuss one thing, maybe not the only thing, that literature and magic share. When Daniel Killmon first raised the possibility of this conversation, I have to say that I imagine few writers who could illuminate the world of the magician as well as him. Magic, and more broadly, of course, illusion, figures prominently in his own literary imagination, and he has written engagingly on magicians and those who bend the truth throughout his career. No more so than in his recent book, F, a Rubik's Cube of Illusion, with a real hypnotist at its core who might have been plucked out of Mario and the Magician. Killmon is the author of numerous deservedly celebrated novels, including Fame, Me and Kempinski, and the international bestseller Measuring the World. NYU is fortunate to share Daniel with his other home, Berlin, as he is the Eberhard Baron Goethe Chair in the Department of German this year at NYU, as well as writer-in-residence at the New York Institute for the Humanities. Joining Daniel tonight is the meta-illusionist Mark Mitten, a professional and practicing magician who has performed throughout the world, in addition to working in film, television, the stage, and Cirque du Soleil. He is also a scholar and a serious student of the trade. Mark regularly presents on perception at universities and conferences in North America and Europe, including the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, and his lecture with the late Nobel laureate, Dr. Gerald Edelman of the Neurosciences Institute. I'm not going to list the illustrious number of people he has performed in front of, but I will say a couple of the venues where he's performed. The Olympic Games, in war-torn Liberia, in hospital wards around New York City, and in a Mexican orphanage with members of the band Guster. His magical hands are featured in a video by They Might Be Giants, and he appears in Tony Oursler's latest video project, Imponderable, in which he plays both Oursler's grandfather, Fulton Oursler, and Harry Houdini. Now I'm going to do my own magic trick and make myself disappear and welcome you guys to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening. So this is going to be a conversation, so we're going to talk about a few topics. It isn't impossible that Mark will at some point decide to give a short practical demonstration, but this is going to be a conversation. So, but it's not impossible that we will do some. Anyway, I always loved magic and magic tricks as a child and as a young adult, and so I got good books, I practiced, I got better and better, and then suddenly I got good enough to understand and to realize that for real pros, I was actually the worst. I was like the nightmare of the professional magician, the amateur who loves to do some amateur magic, because that is the worst thing for a real magician. If I show you a trick which I learned from a book, a trick by one of the great magicians, and I do it badly, which I will because I'm not a professional, then I ruin it for everyone, because you will see through the illusion. If I write a bad book, others can still write good books. My bad book doesn't ruin other people's good books. With magic tricks, it's not like that, and therefore I stopped. But a few years later, then I got to write my first novel in 1997, which was about a magician. For very complex reasons, it hasn't been translated into English. The complex reasons are that my English publisher and didn't like it. So I will not go into detail about that book because you can't read it, but it brought me in contact with quite a few magicians, and I have always followed the magical profession with deep admiration and respect and enthusiasm. And a few years ago, I met Mark at a party where he performed gracefully, although a few children, and it was a performance for adults, it wasn't a children's performance, but a few children really tried to make it hard for him. And he mastered this challenge beautifully and gracefully, and afterwards we talked, and we have never stopped talking since. And as you heard in the introduction, Mark is not only a successful magician, he's also extremely interested in philosophy and psychology. And when he doesn't tour the world as a performer, which is always, then he actually also tours the world to speak with philosophers. And so I jumped at this wonderful opportunity, and I will ask him now a few things I always wanted to ask him. And the first question would be a very simple one, but it's always good to start with the personal. How does one become a professional magician? How did it all start for you?
Step by step.
Yeah.
So I started at 9. Like a lot of boys between the ages of 6 and 12 start with magic. And there are some little girls that perform magic, but some developmental psychologists that I know, they think it has to do with little boys dealing with power issues because it's very consistent. And that could be true. So, but I was at 9, and then I started with a Chex magic kit from eating a bunch of Chex cereal and sent in my box tops, and I received this, and then I started performing. And then at 11, and my first show was just at a show and tell in 5th grade. And then I started doing shows for hire, which were birthday parties at 11, and that led to doing local TV. I tried to impress a young woman by going on the Western Duluth JC's telethon, which went well. And that led to kids show, and then college, and studied economics, which I didn't know was another way of studying the Scottish Enlightenment, and then went on to study with a great master. Ever since I was a little kid, there was, and this is kind of an unusual way to become a professional magician, which is to become an apprentice, but it is the classic way. And I became an apprentice to a man that I saw in Dick Cavett when I was 12, and had always wanted to study with. And I called him up, just like almost all masters demands, over 6 months, and then I begged him, once a week, and
Like in Zen Buddhism, he said first no, and he kept saying no, and you kept begging him?
yeah.
Wonderful.
And and then when he taught me to teach, actually, one of the things he said, okay, so if you get somebody who's no good, what you say is, you have a special gift just like I did, and what you need to do is go away on your own and develop that uniqueness. If I was to teach you, I would destroy what is fundamentally you, which always seemed a very polite way to say so long. And then of course, all the people that he didn't want to teach, he'd say, it's really not so good. Come back next week.
And so at some point, he said that to you?
Almost immediately.
Ah, very good. So, and that master was the legendary Slidini, if I understand correctly. And but then how does this actually work? A magician teaching another magician, and then also related to that, Slidini was I think he's called the master of misdirection.
Yes.
He was very important also for developing that concept of misdirection, if I understand correctly. But how do you teach misdirection, and how do you practice misdirection? I mean, for example, we all know that thing, or many of us might know, others might not want to know about it, about a surgeon's learning curve. A surgeon is actually allowed to kill a few people before he's taken seriously. It's true, ask a surgeon. Only if so because you cannot be really good when you start out. And misdirection is one of these things where, again, if you do it wrong, you ruin it. So how do you actually practice and learn misdirection?
So I was very, very lucky. So before my very first lesson, so he finally said yes. I finally went to one of his performances, and after the performance, I begged him for a lesson, and he finally said, okay. which was that Monday night. And that was on a Friday night. And on that Saturday, I walked into a local magic shop, and there was one of his first long-term students, a guy named Jim, the first guy that had done a full master's level apprenticeship. Not that it was formal, it was just that he was the guy that had spent 3 years with him at that point, and in the 50s. And I couldn't believe it. So I begged him to teach me how to learn from Slidini. And he told me to keep repeating the question, how do I let my audience see magic? And he didn't answer it. And some of the other questions that he told me to ask him, he answered. That question he treated very specially. And so finally, after 3 months, and I was going like 3 or 4 times a week, asking this question, so how do I let my audience see magic? And so finally he turned to me at the end of the lesson. Usually these would go from 7 till 2 in the morning. And at 2 in the morning, he turns to me and he goes, well, about the magic. And I'm taking out the Italian accent because he was from Foggia in the south, and then Buenos Aires, so he had a very thick Italian accent. But what he said was, so I teach you about the magic. I teach you my tricks teach you the principles, and the principles teach you magic. And it's basically been absolutely spot on, but not so obvious, that by doing his tricks that he worked so hard at, to figure out what in those tricks was quintessential, and then what was quintessential in those tricks has been exactly what I've been talking to these neuroscientists about. It's that detail. So his specialty was not just misdirection, it was physical misdirection. The kind of misdirection would take with or without language. So, of course, this is an interesting subject to philosophers and psychologists and biologists, and everyone in a way, because it's basically embodied epistemology. How do we know what we know? And so, anyway, it was an amazing lesson.
So in a way, you just already mentioned the psychologists and something that and the philosophers, and something that I find fascinating, and I feel kind of insecure on this topic now because David Chalmers is here. But so
Me
in
too.
a way, how can we not? But in a way, so much of, I think for the first time ever, philosophy, or some parts of philosophy, have become kind of an experimental science, or have at least something to do with real experiments. So, for example, the famous experiment about blindsight, is something that most people might have heard about, where people who think they cannot see a color will name the color right when asked to guess, or then the more famous experiment about inattentional blindness, that famous gorilla experiment, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But Eric told me before that this invisible gorilla, you can watch it on YouTube by typing invisible gorilla, that by now it has become the most famous psychological experiment in the world. So we're going to talk about the gorilla in a moment, but before that I would like to ask in a more general term, now that so many practical experiments in science look like magic tricks, what is it that a magician, as a practitioner, as a professional fooler of the mind, can tell us about how consciousness works?
And I should add, in addition to David Chalmers, behind him is David Edelman,
course, yeah.
who's Gerald Edelman's son, who's done lots of experiments as well, and is a neuroscientist, and working in this area. So actually, the answer was I didn't know. So what happened was, when I was studying with Slidini, I was also working at a law firm as a paralegal to pay for my, well, I originally was in publishing, but that didn't work out, getting home at 2 and trying to get into, it was Scholastic right down the street here, and I was trying to get in by early in the morning, and it didn't work. So that led to a new occupation, which was in late night paralegal, which worked out really well. But then I got a job from Big Apple Circus as one of their original hospital clowns. They have a program called the Clown Care Unit, which started at Columbia Presbyterian in 1986. So I was doing all those things. I was studying with Slidini, I was doing my paralegaling, and I was doing my hospital clowning. And a strange thing happened, which was Slidini told me about this specific incident where he had conned a World War II soldier who had come back when he was doing hospital shows. He had conned him, he believes, into getting better. And the doctor was all blown away because of this technique that he used. So inspired by that, there was a little boy who wasn't walking psychosomatically. He was 14, who looked 6. And long story short, you can read about this in Frank Wilson's book, called The Hand, about the hand-brain connection. He's a neurologist. And it's a strange thing, and it's embarrassing to say, actually, because if you change somebody else's life or have any part of that, it actually is a burden as much as something exciting. But it went, let's just say it was a con that went well. And this little boy who had a renal patient, and he looked sick, 6, but he actually was 14, it worked. And my con was we offered him a job as a clown. And he started working as a clown, and the desire to get to that job actually encouraged him to start walking after he hadn't walked for a long time. So then this asked this profound question inside of myself, well, then maybe this magic just isn't about this magic. It was embarrassing and strange, actually, and also really exciting, but almost too exciting to even acknowledge. So then this led to interacting with Frank Wilson, who was writing a book, and he started asking me a lot. And then I worked on that for 15 years when I met David Edelman's brother, who I had gone to college with. And then he said, you got to meet my dad. So he trained me in the language of his father, the language of immunology and consciousness theory, which is what Dr. Edelman was interested in. And when we met, we didn't stop talking. We met and we talked straight for 5 hours, and right to the point when I was going to start giving a presentation at NSI, because there was something deep. There was a deep connection, which is both connected and a little bit different from the popular trend of neuroscience.
And relating to that, I think is what you told me when we talked about the invisible gorilla experiment, which is, again, it's you can watch it on YouTube very easily, and it's a group of people who passes balls to each other, and you're asked to count the balls. And I'm going to ruin it for everyone here because. No, should I tell what it's about, or should I ask people to watch? Okay, let's just say, no, okay, I'm not going to go into detail. I'm just going to say watch it. But the point is something else.
The point is,
Yeah.
the point is actually to a magician,
Yes.
Which is what's going on, because as Eric pointed out, the most popular psychology experiment actually has this really interesting history. And I found it very interesting as a magician for the reason that you just jumped around, which was, wait a minute, if it's a psychologist doing a trick and the trick isn't repeatable, right? And only a percentage of the audience see it.
About 50%, I think. Which
Yeah, and it varies radically, actually. It depends completely on other stuff, which is the stuff that, of course, I'm very interested in, right? So then it raises this profound question. So what I did was I had a show, a fancy show for private placement attorneys, a very sophisticated group of perceivers. So I will say, actually kind of incredible. And I should explain that part too. My normal clients are really intense type A people who want to catch me, which I love. So when I think about this stuff, you can imagine, so in that context, so I'm with these guys, and then I'm going like, I was in Chicago. That's where their annual convention was at that time. And Dan Simons, and Chris Chablis lives here, but Dan Simons lives in Champaign-Urbana. I drove down to see him.
These are the two scientists who invented that experiment.
Although that's more complicated, even by their own admission.
Who made it famous, so.
Yeah, exactly. Because so I drive down to Champaign-Urbana, and Dan was great. He welcomed me with open arms, and then I said, so I'm interested. You've got a magic trick that fools half the audience, and it's not repeatable. So, of course, no magician could make his living off of such a trick. Then it becomes even fascinating that there's a whole subculture that kind of worships that trick, right? It's kind of like, so now we've got two interesting phenomenon, right? So exactly, and this is kind of what I do with my neuroscientists and consciousness theory friends, is just ask embarrassing questions because my perspective is radically different than theirs. So in this case, I asked Dan, do you think you're testing confusion or testing attention? Because there's an attentional effect in your movie, and there's also a confusion effect. And I should just explain, this confusion is really deep, but do you understand what I mean? Just think of family, instead of thinking of deception as this clinical thing, just think of deception at any family dinner, right? Right, so you've got a signal noise issue going on with deception. So the way Julianne talked about deception is poetic and beautiful, but there's also just a normal way to say that deception normally interacts with perception. And if you don't know, we've all had those moments after family dinner when our spouse or our friend turns to us and says, "Did you know that da da da?" And then I was like, "No," and then you realized it reinterprets your last 3 hours, right? So because it's all an information and signal noise issue going on, and so that's what I was asking. So there's noise, which is confusion, and we can use that to fool as magicians. But although I wouldn't say that every magician thinks this way, this is what Sladini did. He was a rare thing. He was a pure empiricist, but he couldn't be a rationalist because what he was constructing were non-rational patterns in people's minds. But he was a very, very determined empiricist, which is something that you don't always hear defended these days.
Is that something we can show a demonstration about empiricism and because I find it fascinating this what you said about establishing irrational patterns. It brings me back then to the question, how do you actually become good at that? Because it seems like something you cannot really train. You can either do it or don't do it, but obviously you can become good at it because professionals do. But how can you actually practice fooling people? How can you actually practice misdirection?
Well, one thing we should also do is bring this back also to literature, because then this is where it gets really interesting, because the way words, what you need to, I think one exciting thing here is the way that you need to create illusion in language, and the way I need to create illusion in action are very related and very distinct things. And then there's a question, is there something that's more essential, right? Because there's no question that literature is an art form. And this is something we're discussing. And I think it's highly questionable if magic is an art form. I much prefer to call it just a craft.
That's, by the way, a funny point of disagreement between us, because I do think magic is an art form and he doesn't think that. So maybe we'll come back to that.
Because I'm so completely dependent on action patterns that I'm using from hundreds and thousands of years of work by magicians. I need them. And I think to cut my work off from the context of my teachers and my teachers' teachers and the whole tradition of what we've done, then is a way of misunderstanding. I think also, we didn't go to I realized I never answered, because I realized we have a trap on the gorilla illusion. If we don't expose it, it's really hard to talk about. Right? So it's this other thing. But if you want, I can, but maybe, can some people put your fingers in your ears? How can we do this?
Yeah, maybe we should do that. Everyone who doesn't want to have it exposed, they can just for a moment. But, and for the others, you can just hold it onto their ears. And
so let's do it this way.
Talk.
There's a positive way of doing this too, which is, okay, so I can do it in broad strokes, and I can point you to the research that you could do. What Dan did was something exceptional. When I asked him, he said, is this an explanation? How do you separate the confusion effect and the attention effect? He said, you need to talk to the guy who invented this experiment. And his name was Ulrich Neisser. And Dick Neisser was the father of cognitive psychology. And he wrote a book in 1967 called Cognitive Psychology. And then he won the award of going to teach at Cornell, where there was Eleanor Gibson and James J. Gibson. Eleanor Gibson was the psychologist who worked with babies and the edges. So you might remember some pictures in old magazines of babies crawling off of glass-top tables, and that was Eleanor's work. And then James J. Gibson was so obsessed by action perception that he loved to teach, not every class, but a lot of classes he taught at the local airport, forcing everybody to drive 12 minutes away from the university to the airport so that they would be forced to think about the context of action as well as the action, right? So it's really important. And the grad student who developed that with him couldn't come tonight, but he's a good friend now named Bob Becklin. And they actually sat in Gibson's classes. And Gibson would ask things like, if you see something, let's think about the point of view. Is it like when you're driving? And then he actually developed that into snapshot, aperture, like, snapshot, like, a photo, aperture looking through a hole, ambient, just like us, all of us right now with our seated in chairs, and ambulatory, which is, ambulatory. But if then you get up, now we've got something that he didn't write about, which was interdependent ambulatory, which is a circumstance that I love to perform in because, as we know, we get so much information when we're interacting with people. So the extent to which we look at this interaction or ignore it is really important in this discussion that I've had with psychologists, philosophers, and biologists.
Yeah. So also, I just decided I will just tell you what's going on in that YouTube video. It's so so because otherwise some people might get angry. It's some people are passing a ball to. It's a group of people passing a ball to each other. You are asked to count the passes, and meanwhile, a gorilla walks through a big fat man in a gorilla costume walks through through the setting, and 50% of people who, because they're busy counting the balls, won't see that. So when we talked about that, and I asked you what's the difference between this experiment and one of your tricks, because you don't have a 50 percentage of success. Yours is much better, I think pretty close to 100%. And you said something that really got me thinking, although it was such a simple answer. You said, because I am not a video. And I think that kind of goes to the heart of what magicians do, also opposed to what, for example, I do, because I am a video in a way. When I write a book, I am a movie. In a way that I cannot adapt the book to the situation and the attention situation and the psychological mind frame of every single reader the moment he or she is reading it, obviously. And that's also why with a book I have a much less impressive success rate than a magician. There will always be a significant amount of people who will not be thrilled by that book. Whereas what you do, in a way, you can, and you do, adapt to the situation. It's in a way, when we compare it to arts, I think, and maybe you would disagree, I think what you do is most similar to jazz in a way, to free jazz, because you really, you have a set of techniques, but then you adapt to what's going on in the moment, what's going on right now. And I think, in a way, because of this openness, that's why the success rate of good magicians is like 100%.
Remember, there's different kinds of magic. And remember, my master's specialty was physical misdirection. So that you'll also hear there's a lot of information now on the way, what I think it is cognitive psychologists reporting their own conclusions with magicians. They enlist magicians to tell stories that they already believe, as opposed to working with magicians on more complex possibilities. So if you turn on Brain Games, you'll see what I mean, like common ideas that people see their expectations and things like that. Which is very different than under which situations do people see their expectations and when does that not work, which is the kind of question that you ask if you're trying to go for 100% deception rate, which is because that might work sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. And also, sometimes you can really shock people by being completely outside of any kind of expectation paradigm. So that's also very useful. But you'll notice people who do magic on stage, that's more like movies, right? Because you need to tell the lighting people exactly what to do. You need to tell the music people when to hit the cue. So they'll go cue to cue to cue to cue. Whereas if you're just interacting with people, so in a way, they're working for the ambient situation with people at seats turning their heads, much more like Plato's allegory of the cave, right? And down in the cave watching the shadows. But then there's other people that once you get outside the cave and you start interacting with the world, that's a different kind of magic.
By the way, I stopped you before, or I interrupted you when you were just about to show a demonstration. So I think
All right. Okay, so then if you think about it, then there's a question in terms of study that's being asked by. So I'm saying that in that great popular tape that Dan Simons and Chris Shibley did, there's a really big question because so then I'm saying it's really hard to study because it confuses. Or it brings together confusion and attention. So first of all, it should be said that The original experiment was aimed at that. Ulrich Neisser was trying to show the weakness of the whole cognitive psychology paradigm. He wrote a book, and we've all been there sometimes. He was the underdog now, even though he defined the paradigm. And he wrote this book called Cognition and Reality. And the reaction, he told me, was worse than rejection. It was complete despondence. Nobody wanted to hear it because his field was too successful only 9 years later. It exploded in a quick reaction against Skinner's behavioralism. So then he created this experiment to show that cognition, and thinking only about cognition, was not a necessarily efficient way to think about action perception or social perception. And because basically he said that in social perception and in physical perception, it was much more complex. So the question then, is there a kind of illusion that you can do? So the first thing that normally when you hear people talk about perception, they talk about cause and effect. It's what we all learn at school. But magicians never think that way. What we learn is effect, method, and presentation. So to translate that into cause and effect, it's effect, what the audience sees, method, what we do, or cause, and then the presentation or context. So we think in terms of cause, method, effect that you see, and context. So already we have a more complex model and notice it's not relative, it's context dependent. So it's specific, but it's only specific in context, in the way that you have to think about the words in your books. They're context dependent, right? So here's the simple trick from Max Malini, and it's a great trick because you can see the trick and the trick at the same time, all right? So you can see the glass penetrate through the glass, but you can also see what I'm doing. So I love that trick. And also, then these... oh, so it's hard to see that these glasses actually took forever because this is an old beer drinking. Like I matched this against, I studied with Ozzie Malini, who's the son of the master before my master, named Malini. His real name was Max Katz, and his son was Ogier or Ozzie Katz. And Ozzie taught me to use these glasses because they sounded just right. But you can see if I use unbreakable glasses, it's not as good, right? But actually, I should say Ned Block liked this more. Okay, so like that. Okay, and even for people on a picnic, right, like that. Okay, so even though it's much better to use these like this, just another illusion. Okay. So this is the way. So we always talk about. Daniel loves Kant, and I love early Hume, specifically in the treatise. So this is Hume as it was done for a kindergarten class, right? The need to see A causes B might be psychologically necessary, but it's not necessarily a logical conclusion. So then the question is there a kind of illusion that you could do, that you could study? And do you mind holding this up? So this is great. You're the mic and you're the table. Okay. So basically, I do think that deception is being studied, but I don't think there's a model of deception. That's what's so wild. So we actually, at the SSE, there was a final wrap-up talk by a gentleman who proceeded to give a lecture to summarize conscious theory experiments. And I realized it was this incredibly high percentage were deceptions, but all the people making the deceptions didn't have a good deception model, which I also find really interesting. They were based on cause and effect, but not cause, effect, and context. So in the case, it was very confusing to me when I realized, whoa. But I'll show you what. Here's a little general model next time you need to model deception at a family dinner, all right? So there's two causal patterns instead of one, right? So if I have an apparent causal pattern, okay, so that's a real causal pattern of just dropping coins in a glass. And this is an apparent causal pattern of just pretending to throw. Actually, I realize we have to move this over, if you don't mind. Do you mind holding this, Eric? Do you mind holding Julian? Because the people back there can't see. All right, thank you. So, and I hope I don't hurt you. Okay, so this is what I want to show you, is that if I combine causal patterns, right? So what I'm doing is I'll use magic wands to show you. If this is A causes B, and this is C causes D, right? And I'm suggesting this is not a bad way to think about tricks, jokes, and ahas, right? So let's say using a kid's joke. So we have, this is actually from a friend's son who gave me this. 2 muffins in an oven. One says to the other, so immediately we jump to a new causal pattern because the muffins are talking. It's really hot in here, and the muffin says, what? A talking muffin. So you get pulled back to the original causal pattern, and then you get the little excitement. So that you could, so believe it or not, when I'm doing tricks now, after working with Sladini, what I really think about is manipulating these 2 causal patterns and thinking about the emergent possibilities. So now I can make it look like A causes D, or B causes C, or whatever, or whatever I want, right? Because it's just fun. And because you're presenting 2 causal patterns in the same relative space and time, what actors talk about in terms of beats, right? So now, thank you very much. So now I'm just going to drop the coin, but I'm going to add another causal pattern. Oh, and hit Julianne.
Okay.
Pardon me, maybe a little lower. My
All right.
shoulder's going. Okay, so like that. So I throw it, and now I can add to this illusion, right? So I'm trying to expose, first of all, do it badly, so you can kind of see the trick, right? So, right? So I'm just dropping it and adding one of those, right? So it's kind of okay. But if I work on this, for one thing, I shouldn't show you the center of my body. Just like a karate guy, I should hide it, right? And if I go like this, now it starts to become more robust, as if the coins really are coming here. We can actually go farther and make it look like the coins are coming up through the glass, like so, right? And through the other coin, like that. So once it's not accurate, you can kind of play with the 2 causal patterns and actually use it as a kind of way. It's almost like a computer program. You can just tweak it as you like. Anyway, so that's a version, and we have studied that with eye trackers, and that's a trick that can be fully exposed, but still your eyes go to the wrong place. So that's like the gorilla, but what I was trying to do is make a trick that could be studied under intense scrutiny, even after exposure.
Yeah, that what you just did, it brings me also to a more general question, also about the history of magic. I mean, isn't it interesting that magic as an art, or maybe as an art, but it's something that was enjoyed and that gave aesthetic pleasure, became big in the late 18th and in the 19th century. So I'm thinking, for example, of Robert Houdin or Johann Nepomuk Hofzinser, who the inventor, as far as I know, of modern salon magic, who is very close to my heart as a Viennese. But I'm kind of baffled by this inverse connection. The Enlightenment mind wants to understand, but on the other hand, the adult and rational attitude of the audience of a magic trick is to accept and enjoy that you don't understand, to accept the kind of the defeat of your mind and be happy about it. Isn't that strange? The moment we being, meaning humankind having reached enlightenment, the moment we feel sure about our grasp of the forces of nature, we like to enter into this delicate game of being deceived. Isn't that an interesting inverse connection of enlightenment and the rise of magical performances?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, then it's also tied to Mesmer, going from Austria to France and his popularity, and then coming through Canada to becoming spiritualism with the Fox sisters, then going back, and then you get this huge popular movement. And that's when the magic shows, a lot of the popular big magic shows, there's another thing too, though, which is magic in plays, which also has a whole tradition, but especially pantomimes, Christmas pantomimes in England, also mixed narrative and with magic tricks. And one interesting thing is that Georges Méliès, who actually then took over Robert Houdin's theater, actually studied those when he was a young man. And then when he developed a film vocabulary, he was thinking very much like a magician. So people always credit him in film with creating special effects, but I don't think they think enough about him as a magician with lots of experience and thinking about what an effect is and how an effect is different than narrative, and then brings that narrative together with the effect to create the language of film.
So that brings me to a question I always wanted to ask, but I'm not really sure it makes sense, but I'm going to ask it anyway. To what extent has the good magical performer to fool himself too? When you make something disappear or transform itself, does there have to be in some way a small part of you that has to believe in it too, so that it will be more convincing? Do you feel sometimes, is there a part of you that feels surprised too, and that part of you feeling surprised actually makes the illusion work even better, or does that not make any sense at all?
No, that's the confusing thing about doing those tricks while you're explaining them. Yeah. And what Slidini used to say, you know, if I go into an accent, because that's how I remember it, was with his strong accent, but what he said is, so every move got to be natural, every word got to make common sense, but most of all, you got to believe. And but he did have this great exception, which is why I always think about tricks, jokes, and ahas, because he said, when it comes to comedy, instead of every word, and by the way, when he says words, he means every statement that you could also make through mime or in some way. But he says every word got to make perfect nonsense. And the example that he gave was Groucho eating his shoe, right? So when you watch in The Gold Rush, yeah, what did I say? Oh yeah, I know. You know what? That was me correcting, because I'll tell you what it is. To be absolutely fair, when he first told me this, he told me it was Harpo, and then it took me a while to actually do the study and realize he was talking about Chaplin. So actually, I was just in my mind, I was remembering what he said, which was Harpo, correcting to Groucho, but it's Chaplin. So, but it actually is. But that's how memory is funny. So, and now you know what he really said. But when he said he gave the eating the shoe an example of perfect nonsense. And actually, I'd love to hear what you think about it, because it's like when you create magical realism, right? So he said, if the shoe looks like licorice, in fact, in some of the modern improvements, it does look like licorice. If you look at the old films, it looks perfect, right? Because it's a little hazy. In the modern films, when they clean them up a little too much, it looks like licorice, and it's not as good. And also, if his acting doesn't look hungry. Now that you can't change with the cleanup, he looks hungry, and he also, with great panache, he takes the top of the shoe away as if he's, you know, like deboning a fish. It's just perfect, and all the micro movements, and he gave that as an example of perfect nonsense. So it was wrong, but it was right.
It was right because it was done so well in the sense that Chaplin, in a way, while he did it, believed that he was eating something very good.
And his micro movements were the same as if he was deboning and eating a fish. Mm-hmm. And see how it's context dependent? And it's also, even if he did the best acting in the world, but his prop man wasn't good, then Slidini would argue it's no good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense, yeah. Which again brings me back to the question, and I promise this is the last time I'm going to bother you with the same question, but how do you practice that? How do you practice this kind of psychological surplus, this kind of being convinced yourself by the illusion you're creating? Is it just, I mean, don't you need a huge test audience over the years until you get good as a young starting out magician? How do you do that?
You do.
I mean, I know that for example, students of dental schools, they perform on other students of dental schools. But is it comparable to that, or how does it work?
Yeah. Well, this is where you go. Well, first of all, you know, just like you probably read a lot, yes. Right? So when you read a lot, then you learn about when you accept or reject literature, yes. Right? Yeah. And when I watch magic tricks, I learn as much, and also physical comedians and also performers, I learn when I accept it and when I reject it. And chances are sometimes you have a very strong reaction, because people who work in fields tend to have very strong reactions. We get hypersensitive. So I'm sure if we talked to Chaplin about somebody eating a fish, he would be much more precise than either one of us. Because not only did he need to be that good, but he actually was part of his work. So at that time when he was doing that, he probably studied a lot of people and noticed some things. Because if you see it, it's like a study in how people actually eat fish.
That's, by the way, because you mentioned this relationship to, well, to books in my case, and to other performers in your case, so the relationship to tradition that we have. And you said before that you don't quite think magic is an art because you kind of depend on what other people developed and did before you. But I think in a way that makes it an art, because it's the same thing for me. When I write, I depend so much on what other people did before me, and what great books have been written, and also on what books I accept and what books I reject. So I'm still not convinced that magic is not an art.
And I have to say, and Daniel has pushed it a little bit farther. And luckily, he has a friend, Beltrucci, is that it?
Yeah, well, Wolfgang Beltracchi, the Beltracchi, the art forger, who's just out of prison. It was the biggest European art forging scandal of the last 10 years. Yeah, we did a TV show together. It was really fun.
So there's a documentary about him in which, and you realize how technically he thinks. So that's the one thing that, yeah, I see what you mean. Like, you can be a great technician, and then if you only replicate and not create, you know, there is some kind of dividing line there. So who knows? But I guess what it is, I think craft doesn't get enough time these days. Art, you know, everybody wants to be special and say that they follow their muse and be an artist. And everybody wants to be a scientist and say that they don't believe anything and only accept what's proven rationally. And I think there's something so refreshing about craft where you just learn how to do things right, and you meet the best people that you can, and everybody's trying to do their best. Like, that trick took like 30 years. If you talk to my wife, who's in the back, you know, one neuroscientist guessed that it took me 3 months to work that up. But actually, that was slipping it in with tricks over 30 years. So.
Do you have a theory about why is it in the first place that seeing illusions makes us happy? Why is it exhilarating? Why doesn't it just make us angry? Where does the beauty come from? Because isn't it kind of strange that we like it so much?
It is, but like then I put it right back to, there's a great special, and I don't know what it is. It's actually, oh darn, it's about Beethoven, and it's Leonard, help me, on 72nd Street, Leonard Bernstein, and he's giving, it's a kid's talk about the Fifth Symphony and why it's so great. And he said that great art, just for a moment, this is going to build your side of the case, but great art lets the audience know that something in the world is true, something in the world is right. And there is, so I think if you go back to my little causal model, which I think there's another philosopher, David Rosenthal, said, well, every great theory of humor has to explain why a rubber banana is funny. And I said, well, this makes it obvious. If it doesn't look like banana, it's not funny. And if it doesn't bend like rubber, then it's not funny. It's two causal patterns. It's something that looks like something else. It's two causal patterns being juxtaposed. You're eliminating the ambiguity for a moment and then exposing it. Bingo, you get an explosion. So, and I think like with magic tricks, like when you see the coin fly through the air and land in the glass, you know that's not happening. And when you were feeling the coin come up through the glass, you knew that wasn't happening. But if it looks just like it is happening, then there's something satisfying. In the same way a trick, in the same way a joke is satisfying, if it feels like it's kind of real, and then you realize it's a joke, or in the same way an aha, like when you're reading Measuring the World, and it really feels like Gauss and Humboldt were best friends. You know, there's something so satisfying when it's completely and totally plausible. Right? I mean, was that fun? Like when you were balancing, there's a perfect dual reality, right? Those are two causal patterns, two lives of Gauss and Humboldt. And I know that you love the era from your love of Kant. Was it fun to put them together?
Yeah, because putting them together was also creating a structure where there actually was no structure in a way, because they knew each other historically, but in a way the novel created a structure of sense about their parallel lives that in a way wasn't there before I kind of claimed that it was there. So so it is kind of the creation of truth out of lying and deceiving and in inventing something. As Vargas Llosa said, literature is not for telling the truth. Literature is for lying. I love that quote. But in a way, it's still always. I still believe in this old idea that art will lead us in some way or to some sort of truth. So, for example, I think the whole question of whether other minds, whether other conscious beings have experiences roughly comparable to mine, or whether they might be completely different and I have no way of finding that out. That makes sense of a question in theory, but I also think it's a question asked by people who don't read novels. And I think so in a way a novel, even if it's all about lying, it leads us to, if it works, it leads us to the truth that other people actually have emotions and experiences which I can understand and which are very similar to mine. And do you think, I mean, I'm sure you do, but I'm still going to ask, is there a deeper truth about, because in a way, I think, if I can come back one last time to my idea that magic is an art, in the way I think that it gives us deep aesthetic pleasure to watch a magician. But the interesting thing is what is his material? What's the material of the magician? And my theory, just made up on the spot, but my theory would be the magician's material is reality itself.
So Dr. Edelman used to say, he used to jokingly call me the reality mechanic.
I didn't know that, but I love it.
Once again, pushing towards the craft issue. But I did love that, because I love that connection of the high and low. Mm-hmm. Because I mean, once again, even in conscious theory, are we thinking about how we're conscious by ourselves, or are we thinking about how we're conscious with others? And are we thinking about how we're conscious and are we thinking about, mental information in our mind, which definitely is verifiable, and we can connect reason and certainty in our mind, but is it as easy to connect reason and certainty when it comes to our relationship in the world? And then once we're physical, then you are social, because like right now we're talking, but we're all here, and it's physical and social at the same time. It's really hard to start separating, which means it's really hard to get to certainty, because
I think looking at the time, I think now would be a good moment to open this for questions, if there are any.
Did Slidini consider himself an artist?
Absolutely. No, he did. I mean, to understand, and I guess he was, because he defended, like with some, you're a mathematician, and it's like asking the question, is John Conway an artist, right? And then he might not say it, or maybe he does, but to hold new ideas is a really privileged position, and he definitely for many years held privilege. Slidini was born in southern Italy, and then at 12 went to Buenos Aires, where he worked as a tailor by day, and he was in the club scene developing tango at night. So he was in these incredibly privileged positions. And then at 30, he came here, and he developed this whole new way of thinking about magic. So, yeah, I mean, I think he would, and I think everybody in magician. But he was, as you know, one out of two in the world that were considered a master of that level. So it's a rare thing.
Hi. So it seems like so much of the future of keeping magic alive is taking someone at some point under your wing and showing them the skill and kind of bringing them up. Are you doing that with currently anyone now, or is that something that you plan on doing?
Our relationship with information is changing really quickly. What I did is probably, I don't know if a millennial is going to consider a 5-year apprenticeship where you just do everything that the master tells you 4 days a week for 5 years. And actually, my experience was that's not happening, so that's okay. But what I did, that's one reason why I found so much satisfaction in meeting with all different kinds of academics and all kinds of craftsmen. Last week I had an amazing conversation with a filmmaker in London about these issues, exactly how he edits and when, and he had made a documentary about Dr. Edelman 20 years ago, and it was still had changed all his thinking. So, and then we're talking about something, and there's all these there's all these possibilities. There's all this work to be done. So I guess I've really focused on that work to keep specifying it, if that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I'm wondering how much optical illusion is related to magic, or even verbal illusion, the Necker cube that you can't hold still because it bounces up and down, but also verbal magic. For instance, for 20 years, I would laugh at a verbal joke by the Marx Brothers, although I didn't understand it at all until finally it dawned on me when they say, how does it go again? Time flies like an arrow, probably you all know it, and fruit flies like a banana. Everybody laughed and I sat there, but it was like magic. I finally got that time flies like an arrow is a subject and a verb, so you expect fruit flies like a banana, but it's fruit flies like banana. So isn't that a kind of magic too? And aren't we astounded that we are deceived, but we are happy that our normal conventional thinking is disturbed? Isn't there some kind of joy in thinking differently against normal conventional thinking? I was thinking about magic bringing this joy that we are allowed to slip into some other type of thinking, at least for a moment, a type of thinking which may indeed allude to a different kind of truth. Anyway, that's maybe too long, but
I think we both agree.
Yeah, I mean, Mark can answer much better, but I wouldn't say this is a magical trick, this beautiful joke, but it kind of has the structure of a magical trick in a way. It's kind of a parallel structure. It kind of could be used to illuminate to what a magical trick does.
I actually think that that joke's a really good example of this idea of, which I used to think was not a big deal, but then now the more I've been talking to people, it seems like it's surprising. And the philosophers in the room can tell me, we were trying to, it's definitely, I was inspired by the causal chain, which is written about a lot by Hume in his earlier days, about how we link causes together. And I think jokes, tricks, and ahas all smash. And I do think it's actually, there's a reason why tricks, jokes, and ahas all follow this, because it's so important, because it's kind of the essence of how we make hybrids. It's the essence of creation and destruction. Because sometimes we bring things together and it doesn't work and we destroy both, right? Sometimes we bring things together and we get something much greater than what, and that's the idea of emergence. And then there's a question of, that's what I was attracted to Edelman's idea, because he thought about selection in terms of immune response and tried to bring that to the study of consciousness. All right, so quick trick. Yes, thank you, okay. Thank you very much. Okay, don't be sure. Okay, so, classic card trick. Mix up a bunch, and since you, could you point to someone and have them name a card? You just stand right up.
The white shirt in the back? Yes.
Okay, and right from there, and what is your name? Huh? Katya. Oh, actually, okay, so could you say a card if you would?
9 of hearts.
Are you serious?
Yes.
I mean, that, which is kind of amazing, right? It's kind of impossible. Okay, because you said stop on anyone. You were thinking of the 9 of hearts. And can I just show them? Before we even started here, can you show them? Can you open them right there? In Daniel's jacket, it's kind of embarrassing. We put one card, just get it, right? And you'll see there's no other card in there. And it was the 9 of hearts. The chances, incredible.
A quick question that relates to the difference between art and craft. Craft, to some degree, you already know where you're going with it, and with art, it's more of a discovery. But maybe when you develop a new piece, how much of it is a discovery for yourself?
Well, that's just, absolutely. And that's why I love, I love craft and promoting craft, because it just is not being talked about enough. And then as a result, people think that you can learn, like this actually, the other day, a 28-year-old turned to me and he said, everything I want to learn is not on the internet. All I care about, and this is the son of a great craftsman. This is the son of the man who made Kermit, Fred Buchholz, who made the Kermit Drive a Bicycle, a great puppeteering craftsman who did all this engineering work for Jim Henson. And his son turns to me, and he'd spent years in Japan studying with all these masters, and he goes, I realize everything I want to learn is not on the internet. All I care about is the last 10%, and that's never on the internet. And I felt like, you are so rare, you know? But that's why I love speaking up for craft, because it's so important that we all, because also I'm worried about the ideas that are getting, because I studied with an 83-year-old when I was 23 and he died at 90, I'm worried about how much information is getting lost right now because of this misunderstanding about information and the nature of embodied information versus declared or printed information.
I wanted to press you both a little bit on this analogy between what you do and what you do, Daniel, because I'm a little skeptical, and in order to explain, I'll transpose it to painting. If we had a painter paint a trompe-l'oeil window on that wall with such skill that most of us thought it was a window and might even walk into it and try to get out to the street, that would be more like what you do. But if we had a Rembrandt painting on the wall in front of us of a woman, say, and Rembrandt uses his magic to create flesh tones and so forth, that would be another kind of illusion, but none of us would think that there was a woman standing there. We'd all be clear that it was a painting. Those seem to me two completely different kinds of illusion.
This opposition, it does make sense, but on the other hand, as something who has seen lots of amazing magicians, I think that the comparison of the magical art to the trompe-l'oeil painting is too simple. The good magicians do something that's much more complex. In a way, first you also know that what they do is a painting, and to speak in this in this frame, you also know that it's not going to be real, and then they do something. And I find it hard to explain too, but I'm convinced that they do something much deeper about exposing the complex, strange nature of reality and about consciousness in a way. So in consciousness, in consciousness theory, there's this big topic of qualia, for example, and some philosophers claim that qualia, like the redness of red or the fullness of pain, that it doesn't really exist, which on one hand is something I don't quite know what to make of, and I don't quite understand that. On the other hand, in this claim that we can experience something, or we can think to experience something which we actually don't experience, is something that the magician deals with all the time. So, in a way, the questions that magic can, and the truths and the complexities that magic can expose are much deeper and more complex, I think, than just this thing of, oh, I thought this was a window, but it's not a window. So also, and I'm going to be finished in a second, but this is something I feel very strong about because I like the magical art so much. In a way, also, it kind of like in a way completely different from, but then also in a way similar to great painting or great literature, it makes us feel that what a mess we are in a way. How hard it is for us to understand reality, to come to terms with reality, for to see how foolable we are, to feel what Kant called the crooked timber of humanity, and still we enjoy that demonstration. It doesn't make us angry and it doesn't make us depressed, but we enjoy it. And I think there's an element of real art that goes beyond the trompe-l'oeil in that. But sorry, that was far too long a reply. I know you're all waiting for the back trick.
No, but it's a perfect transition too. Should we do that?
Good. Yes.
No,
yes.
Because I do think it's something that. So in this context of, if you don't have the craftsman to go to, right? If you only have these cartoons in your mind of the artist and the scientist, I don't think there's a lot of place to put this stuff. So what you asked is a really great thing, because you said, how does a parent interact with actual? I'm going to buy that as actual, but this one is only a parent. So, but magicians actually deal with this constantly. And it's a big question in consciousness theory. Are we taking things inside, or are we, so for instance, even on time, Dr. Edelman wrote, and it's been a concept that's been out there, but he wrote that book called The Remembered Present. So even right now, is it right now, or is it the right now that we're remembering, that we take in through our, our sensory inputs and then remember? And if it's not there even momentarily, then how is it even now? So what's the connection between those two things? And I think this one reason why it's hard if you take a straight, as we're defining science today, approach, and this is why actually Dr. Edelman would get in trouble. But the irony of why he would get in trouble is when he talked about these issues, he'd say he had this really special thing called selection, which was a general case of natural selection. And that allowed him to actually have things interact. It wasn't about seeing the world exactly as it is. It was, how does the way we interpret the world interact with the world? What is the essence of this interaction? Now, if you're going to only hold one causal pattern, that's pretty hard to do, right? So what are you even selecting from? What's the repertoire that's being generated? And what's the selective pressure? At minimum, you need two causal patterns. If you're going to deal with a thing like us, making causal patterns in the world, interacting with the causal patterns that are outside of our sensory data. We all have had the experience of when that process doesn't go right and when that goes wrong. And I do think that magic tricks and jokes and ahas, like reading great literature or listening to great music, is a great way to approach this. And I think right now the interaction hasn't been deep enough because they can't get to the craftsman. Because the Jerry Edelman that I met was the guy that wrote a paper that was so controversial, he had to publish it as a letter to the editor to avoid peer review, because he was going up against a determinist Linus Pauling who wasn't against him, but actually everybody else was quivering for political reasons. We don't want to go up against him. And so he snuck in the paper, and that was the first paper cited in his Nobel Prize. And that's how doctors know what the structure of your antibodies is, right? So that's extraordinary. Now, is that art or science? It's not science. It wasn't peer reviewed. It was just guts, And so what is that, right? So that's the guy that I connected with most. I talked to others. I didn't find any connection between apparent and real. That's what I needed. Somebody who cared so much about apparent and real interacting, right? So, and that's what magic is amazing. And that's what when I read your books, that's what I feel. You get it right. Right? It's wrong. Your lies are perfect.
Okay, now we want to know about the bags.
Okay. So this is about getting it right when you know you're doing it wrong. Like Daniel does the perfect lie, or in magic tricks, using two causal patterns to tell one story. Once again, something all of us do all the time, right? So, can I use your bag? Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Julian. Okay. So, this trick is so bad it's considered a gag. But it's the bag gag is a perfect trick to understand. So it's a trick and it's a joke. Once you get your bags open, just wait. Don't do it right away. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna stand up on this chair. It's very dangerous. But it's the only way you'll see it, right? Thank you. Dankeschön. All right, so here's the trick. And I want you all to do this trick. But remember what's going on. So don't repeat this right away. Your first inclination will be to repeat it, right? Right? So here's, okay, don't repeat. Just watch first, right? That's the hardest part. First part of master training here. All right? Okay? Good? So you take the invisible ball. So you have the apparent, it's not a real ball, but we want to make this ball as real as possible, right? So throw it up. Catch it in the bag. So you just throw it up, catch it. So this is real. Oh, I guess it is real. Okay? So to make it real, what you have to do is combine that with this snap. And if you can't snap, it's only about getting the timing perfect, which means you can also just hit it from the back. But if you can snap, you snap your fingers and insert them in the bag and snap like that. that does two things. It makes a noise, and it makes the bottom of the bat go back as if a ball is going inside. So now you throw it up, and you catch it. You throw it up, and you catch it. Now, do you want to give it a try? Okay. Good. Okay, good. What was your quick reaction to that? What did it feel like when you were catching the invisible ball? What? Very funny. Anything else? Inept. Perfect. Anybody else? Better than what you do. Well, here's what's funny. But it's almost impossible to turn off that judgment, right? You know, like what I always, sometimes, when I'm being forthright with a bunch of college kids, I'll say, don't you feel like you suck? And they all go, yes. They all go, so, because it brings out those basic, but I'd also suggest that what you're feeling is the specificity of action. It's what you're watching. When you watch Chaplin take that shoe apart, you're being that specific, and he's doing it. He's living up to your worst, harshest criticism. How does he do that? It's impossible. So now, that's the first step, is to get it right? And most of you have not thrown invisible balls into bags, but yet you've got a program in there that says, I'm going to get this perfect, right? Which is amazing by itself. Now, once you're physical, you're social. So what I'd love you all to do, it's a bit of bedlam, but it could be fun. Everybody stand up, and with your person next to you, choose one ball and make the ball go back and forth between the two of you, and try to get it perfect. All right?
Thank you for coming. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Daniel.